Hello everyone, today we talk about the Abacus school and the other professional schools. You know that the Abacus school is a term applied to any Italian school or tutorial after the 13th century, whose commerce-directed curriculum placed special emphasis on mathematics, right, such as algebra, among other subjects. Right, and as you'll see now, these schools sprang after the publication of Fibonacci's book of the Abacus. Right, Abacus stemming, in Latin, coming actually from Greek abax, and that means slab drawing board, and it's a word actually of Semitic origin, more deeply probably related to the Hebrew habak, which goes for dust, so something you can, erase the arrangement of the tokens in this sense on the board, but more properly, it's like tablets in a way. And also Fibonacci's introduction of the Hindu-Arabic numeral system. Right, that is at the base, in fact, of our numerical writing in the West. So after the Abacus school was properly like a professional preparation, right, of the late stage, we could say, of what we could call high school, if you want. There were first other levels, right, 2, 3 generally of school, of basic school, we could say, after which the parents that intended to direct the children to the commerce or the of the artisanal activity, prepared them to, in fact, to started them in the school of Abacus. That was known because of this squared tablet, which through the help of tokens of different color and thickness, known as quartiroli in Italian, they carried out accounts, right? And this is something, I don't know about you, but when I was a child, I had my own tiny abacus that I could. I played it mostly because the tokens were like all colored and they looked funny. I didn't count much on that regard, but I mean it's still something that in at least in Western culture, I didn't know honestly about in other places in the world, but I presume, like, aside from the Western influence through later, I don't know, colonial phase, if similar things spread. I think so, because this is actually a very simple, should be a pretty universal way of counting, and teaching elementary maths to children. And it's something that really stems, at least in the West, from these very moments, from the 13th century. This Abacus school, the first one we know, is the one of Bologna of 1265, right? And the let's say standard manual of the time was the Liber Abbaci, that, as we have said before, was written by Leonardo Fibonacci in 1202. Right? He was a peasant. We have encountered him in other videos. Actually, we have seen how he had traveled a lot in the Muslim world. He had, at this time, the peasants were one major maritime republic. They had warehouses a bit all over, especially Western Mediterranean, but also in the Eastern Mediterranean. And that's where these merchants and sons of merchants were educated, and where they could access works of that at the time were pouring in the West like crazy, like mostly from through Spain, via Spain, but now the proper maritime highway the Italians had strengthened now was carrying that. It would remain that like up to the Renaissance, right? And these people were therefore acquainted to an enormous range of different languages and systems of communications, and naturally, just as we'll see now, as being involved in trade, they dealt with some of the greatest diversity of trade goods, right, in this broader traffic. So here we're talking about massive volumes, like the 13th century is the apex of intercontinental trade traffic. Here literally Europe is open to China. Like the same thing about the Venetians go up to China on a regular base, or there is a beautiful literature about it. Just think about Marco Polo. It doesn't even matter it to be kind of real. It's important is that it's plausible, and the fact that these travelers, these merchants, were open to the concept in the 13th century of literally going to the other side of the globe to make a living, right? To make money, to even be involved in something greater, like in diplomatic, cultural, administrative missions, and so on. So this is a moment naturally of great boasting of fields like mathematics, properly like algebra, and not an account. Right? It's no surprise that this thing is pioneered actually exactly by these Italian city-states that have so much ties that properly lead this dynamic in Europe. And Fibonacci had brought back fundamentally, brought in the West the new calculus methods, right, for which he's mostly famous. Think about his sequence. And very importantly, this, what you could call revolutionary use of the Arab or Indo-Arab ciphers, right? That we know it's revolutionary. I don't like the term revolutionary because it's kind of, but it you can hear it really corresponds literally to a deep change in properly the not just in this case of a tool of simply a writing system, but properly of another type of looking at language, right? Now, of bringing new mathematical theories and systems of, especially of calculus, that would remain, that they would develop in these areas in the 13th and 14th century. They wouldn't be changed up to the 16th, right? Here there is a solid tradition that is instated in the West on the base of these very works that would remain unchanged for centuries. And Fibonacci's work was written naturally in Latin, and these works eventually would be translated into vernacular by several masters, teachers of arithmetics, that for a need that was naturally more evident for a school that taught to students that hadn't normally, in the case of these tradesmen, most family of businessmen, undertaking the study of Latin, right? Differently from, I don't know, juridical studies or other, even theology, of course, etc. It's not that these people didn't know how to write or to read in Latin, but they surely had a different paradigm, a different orientation that was much more practically oriented. Maybe these people didn't know perfect Latin. They didn't know that, but they knew a bit of Latin. They spoke Italian. They knew Greek. They knew Arab. They knew French, Spanish. This actually blended this coinage that in Mediterranean was up to, frankly, the last, like in the 19th century still. Italian was like the lingua franca of the whole Mediterranean. Asked the British, the Royal Navy officers were sent to Mediterranean, said the first thing they had to speak Italian. It doesn't matter if they had to deal with the Turks, with the barbarians, or with the Spanish, or with the same Italians. The importance that was this kind of homogeneous language that naturally included lots of different varieties in this regard. But that's probably a dimension, a cultural dimension that had matured in this time, right? Mediterranean had mostly been in previous millennium and mostly Greek-speaking, eventually Arab-speaking, now mostly Italian-speaking lake, we could say. And all these manuals of Abacus essentially taught, aside from the four essential operations, also much more complex calculus, such as, for example, the fractions. But not just at the simple level, the calculus with one or more incognita, the calculus of interests and discounts, right? Consider that in the monetary system of the time existed the pounds of 20 solidi and the solidi of 12 denarii, right? And therefore there was this need of changing the measure of unit and equating simply to a fraction of the value, what the total really was. Also the transformations of different units of measures proper, right? The calculus of areas or surfaces, right? Because as we will see now, it wasn't just a theoretical thing. Like all these developments in the field of mathematics were aimed, we could say exclusively in this time, to practical purpose, right? These people didn't give a damn about learning pure mathematics, essentially, just for the sake of it. No, these people basically were taking from all of these greater Eastern cultures, like the Arab, the Indian, one of these intense philosophical, scientific, mathematical knowledge that they had largely, in part taken also from other civilizations, especially in the Arab case from the Atlantic, but also in India, India, just as a broader political, social, religious system, had always to do with all this numerical symbolism. Think about all the various cases, the various circles, this masses of men, this numerical symbolism attached to the data. I mean, it's very it's not surprised that it actually stemmed from the Indian subcontinent, and literally applicating them for their practical need. Trade and building, and these people, and this is what the interesting part of this story is, that these merchants were active politicians and engineers and people who were expanding literally their own cities, so they needed to know how to calculate weight, how to calculate dimensions, how to calculate costs naturally, because literally that's what cities were doing. They were building, they were expanding. They needed this more theoretically framed competence, but for still a practical purpose. It's not that they couldn't do that before, that they did it the same. It's just that now they needed something more, theoretically based that could be replicated more quickly among the ever larger number of people who demanded that, and that's where the same Abacus school originates from. And for these reasons, the Abacus manuals offered, besides these practical calculus example, certain little rules, in Italian is known as regoluzze, to learn by heart, right, and to put in practice every time that the occasion demanded that. And we can observe some examples from the same. From the manual of another important work, that is Paul of the Abacus, right? That is one of these other Italian, I don't remember where he was from. It was usually from Tuscany, because Tuscany was, especially in the 13th century, rising more speedily at the center of this trade. And the first example is about the multiplication of a non-fraction number. So the translation goes that, if you want to multiply a healthy and broken number, healthy and broken means either, integral or fractional number, for a number that is in fact healthy and broken, multiply each healthy number for the denominator of its fraction and adds of its broken, literally, and add the numerator, and then multiply the first sum with the other and split this divide for the denominators. The second example is instead about the calculation of the interests rate, right? And he says, if you want to know how many pounds you have to pay fundamentally every year, multiply per 2 and divide per 3 and give the money, right? And this 2/3 relation is referring to the pound of 240 denarii for a year of 360 days, so hence the 2/3. The third example is instead about a measure of capacity, and it says if the width, that in this case is actually about the diameter of a well, is expressed in arms as unit of measure, multiply for the same, and eventually for the depth of the arms, and eventually for 4, and you will essentially get how many barrels it contains. So the Abacus manuals concluded all actually with a series of mathematical games and other brain teasers that had the aim of training the student not just to calculus but also to the logical reasoning, right? A bit like, it happens for today's enigmistic games, right? And this is important because it wasn't just logic was studied in many other fields aside from these ones. For example, in the same century, the university, Frederick II issued at the University of Naples, he had founded himself for the Kingdom of Sicily, that doctors could in fact start studying medicine only after, I think, an entire year of logical studies. Now think about it, right? This is something that today we give for granted because kind of our education makes us theoretically acquainted to that, and generally speaking, in order to study medicine you have to study also lots of things, including physics, chemistry, etc., so that already contain in many ways, if anything from a linguistical point of view, a logic, an obvious logic that is perfected over time. This time it wasn't like that, so there was the acknowledgement that it wasn't much about the mere theory or just even the practice, but having, adapting your mind to kind of a logical thinking that evidently wasn't like to be given for granted, especially if you wanted to carry out, these crafts. And also with these games, the teacher found a way to enrich, more broadly the culture of the student with real problems, right? Or for example, with juridical questions, right? That in the future could be presented to the same student in all likelihood, actually. And this is also important because it's like today, if you study economics, you must understand law in a way or another. So this was naturally added to the curriculum. There's an example about this from Dionigi Gori, who was an Abbacist from Siena, right? Other important mercantile center, and it says a merchant dying leaves the pregnant wife and makes a testament of 1,000 florins, so that a male son would have had to inherit 2/3 of the inheritance, and the remaining to his wife. Naturally, consider that there was no way up to birth in medieval times to know whether the child was male, female, and instead, in the case, in fact, had been female, leaving to the daughter 1/3 of the inheritance and 2/3 to the woman. Now, the unexpected thing happens is that these were twins, that his wife eventually gave birth to a son and a daughter together, and the question posed in the book was, how much has to be corresponded to the son and how much to the daughter, right? And the solution was to, in fact, fraction, as you would intuitively do already with the normal education today, the various, let's say, units of fraction that fraction units that each person compared to the in fact the proportions established in the Testament would receive. So in the case of the son being born, he would have received 2 and the mother 1. In case a daughter would have been born, the daughter would have received 1 and the mother 2. Therefore, the solution identified the proportions between the 3 as 1 for the daughter, 2 for the mother, and 4 for the son, essentially doubling the 2 for the mother. So here he reduced the thing to the minimum common denominator of 1 unit. And here the text says, come back on the rule of the companies, right? And that is in here referring, I think, to the ones of the fractions themselves, and give this, make this proportion about 1 between 1, 2, and 4, and divide the 1,000 florins, right? And you will get essentially here a fraction of, the daughter having 285, that is 5/7. The son will have 571 3/7, right? And the mother will receive the remain. Albeit I think here the text is mistaken in some way, or I don't understand it myself, because it's obviously the sum is divided in 7. At least the 285 and the 571 respectively for the mother and for the son are correct. The remaining 142 would go to the daughter, right? But aside from this, what is important really here is that the mercantile culture, besides that in the Abacus schools that can be considered in many ways as the most innovative school institutions of the Middle Ages, right, was learned eventually and directly from the shops and the warehouses, because it's in these places that the young shop boy found always a manual of marketing, let's call it in this way, the mercature, right? So the art of market, of trade, and often also a portolan, right? These essentially maps of the world that described the principal ports and their technical characteristics. Or if they were lucky at this point, they could even found a Ptolemy, that is a geographical map of Mediterranean Europe, or at least of some of the single regions, right? The portlands were mostly about the coastline, right? And Ptolemy, back in the Hellenistic era, had fundamentally calculated all the coordinates of all various places in the world, Mediterranean world, and yet seemingly in his time hadn't even drawn a map, because the Greeks were highly theoretical and calculated in an empirical way, but it had remained like that, right, with this net of coordinates. But in medieval times, Ptolemy had become the base probably of map, right? We're actually not sure what Ptolemy did himself, but at least there's no evidence he actually drew a map back in the day. But this is interesting because it makes you observe the superimposition of that practical and theoretical we were talking about before, next to and contextualized more broadly in the trade necessity, like on what the young merchant, that the apprenticer had to know about the world in that regard. And in the warehouses in the Fondacon, right? Also, these areas that were, in many ways, sometimes they were just, in fact, warehouses. In other cases, were literally quarters within this port cities scattered all over the Mediterranean. The Italians seized with the complacency of the local authorities, because these people brought sometimes instability when they started killing each other between this competitive maritime city-states, but at the same time they brought a freaking lot of money, because they opened to much broader market, and therefore there was even this necessity of activating the knowledge, the awareness of all of these various cities, of all these various areas where they were, what they were fundamentally, and also technically, what kind of goods you could, take from them, and you could bring to them, and so on. And in the warehouse, the shop boy, however, found mostly precious his master, that is the merchant, the local merchant, with his agents, his farmers, his scribes, his clients, his colleagues, friends, right? That commentated every day the letters that were arriving, right? Because this communication was continuous, right? The course of the exchanges, the prices of the goods, the political news, right? The public or even private events of a city, right? Consider what this work really was. Like, it's not that there is like a state or true central authority. The same city-state here is like, in certain cases, just a set of all these various mercantile / nobiliar guilds that invest in their business. So everything related to the city government, and I don't know, the kings, the emperors, what kind of war was going on, what markets were closed, which other were open, and all these swings even the costs. Here probably there is a market, there is a financial dimension that is emerging, and that's where this context in fact dwells in and expands in, because that is functional to these activities. And therefore, the young apprentice, shop boy, let's put it in this way, had a continuous life school, we could say, that helped him to mature and to make that necessary experience in order to eventually, save for faraway lands in quality of an agent or a factor, or of a great company, right? Or even to start a business on his own, right? And the thing was naturally very, very dynamic. There were lots of opportunities, a lot of markets were being opened at this time. And we could define, therefore, the mercantile shop as a sort of professional institution, right? And this happened in the same way for, actually, even for other crafts of the times. For example, the notaries in the peripheral seats, right? Their principal school was, in fact, once they had ended the phase of grammar school, the statio, right? The station of a notary that put them to transcribe acts, right? So start from doing that, and from which they learned slowly the abbreviational systems of writing, certain specific formulas, the juridical institutions and uses and practices of the place, right? Because every place had naturally its own different law, right? But there was properly a professional class, the professional craft developing. Now, the notaries were rising as some of the key figures next to the merchants for certifying, for legitimizing, for officializing these acts, etc. So everything was becoming all more mechanical, more standardized, but more complex at the same time. And that's where the thing it stemmed from. So that you now needed to know this gradually, but in a functional way, and already being inserted in the job itself, right? And the same happened once again for doctors, right? That had to make practice, or surgeons of the phlebotomy, barbers, for the veterinarians, for the midwives, especially for the architects that at that time they called themselves magistri murorum, so the masters of the walls, but that were capable, as a matter of fact, to already build imposing buildings such as churches, public palaces, but also, channels, bridges, walls, and basing themselves on technical knowledge was mostly learned from the sheer apprenticeship in the great building sites of the time. And there would be a lot to add to this. It's gonna be a very short video for the usual standards, but bro, this starts showing for the first time in Europe really the construction of a standardized curriculum of education. Right, this is something you don't see before. Before that, you see something like, if you want to do it, just do it and learn. Yeah, from maybe already knows the craft, but it's easier, seeing it done than actually developing a proper educational path. Right, here now, the whole European system is inflating, right, and it's ever more complex to manage. Therefore, it required a more structured education, a more intensive education. In many ways, this is happening today. And while in the Middle Ages people understood perfectly what they needed to do in that regard, it doesn't seem that today we're saying, the world is expanding, and maybe we need to be a bit more structurally educated and insisting on that. But if anything, as a strategical move, instead nobody cares, right? Or at least nobody has much of a vision to have a talk about this. The important problems. These people simply created it one on their own, considering this fact that it's true that at the time they didn't have, in fact, the same central government and instead this capacity of imposing even these paths as we do, but in fact they simply built it on their own. They weren't there saying, let's hope that someone fixes that. They simply fixed that themselves. And this was one of, in absolute terms, the 13th century, one of the most successful times in history. In Western civilization, at least it's pretty evident, but it was shared at the time actually by many other countries before the 14th century crisis. And this is important because it can show and should show how civilization doesn't change just because someone decides that the thing has to happen, right, from the above. Right, society always changes by itself, right? And the best thing we can do is to, being in synchrony, or at least having something to approach these changes dramatically, whether we want to kind of to stand them or to orient them in another way, or instead if we want to favor them from the other, but realizing that we are part of the world and we're contributing to change it ourselves, and that we can't always create something new that can work, that can make the thing done in many ways, while other systems are sleepy. And it's literally an entrepreneurial mindset, right? And it's very important, in fact, these theories were developed exactly in this field, right? This mathematics wasn't now enhanced, the calculus, accounting wasn't enhanced in the universities. They studied law mostly, or theology, right? It's the merchants that pioneer mathematics at the time. And this is quite important, and you understand how this emerges from the sheer activity of it. So it's I'm not arguing that today it's necessarily worse, or that we should even make sense to compare these two ages in that regard, but always realize, for example, that now we have a divide essentially between those who tell what things should be done like and what people essentially do them like. And part of the reason is that the world is even more complex to understand, so that if you want to start a small business, it's not that you have the capacities to understand the macroeconomics at the highest levels, but you're still in the game, and theoretically it would be a good investment, probably the best investment, especially for a smaller business, to actually know where you can invest fruitfully and so on. So at the time, these people that were naturally in a very different situation from ours in relative terms to the capabilities of expanding, this was happening at many levels, including war, including many other realities that we once again, it's not that they are necessarily essentially different from ours, but that have at least other dynamics, were, however, directly involved in, directly committed in. They had the vision that could encompass the whole. And starting to expand, in fact, as you understand here, in fields that technically weren't just economical, right? Think about geography. Here, naturally, these people had most of to do as maritime powers with sailing, with knowing, literally where you have to go. Like today, you take a plane and whatever. But we could, contextualize this in saying, what about the rest of the world? What about the world market? What about, the local political situation? What about the local society? How can I have a more precise and realistic view of this, and not transforming, these fields, the science, in mere philosophies of sciences, because this wasn't absolutely what these people were doing. These people were practically oriented, were wired, cent for cent of the time, on the local reality. And this is a key aspect, right? Especially since, great economical crises show us how even the strictly financial dimension has its own risks, of course, by definition, but also that it's not the whole thing. Like that investments, yes, are investments in real assets, but still there is a dimension that here is relatively escaping to the realization of what these assets concretely are. If you base yourself on a purely financially perspective, right? You should be knowing more about that, and this could start literally from a better understanding of the world in a broader sense, right? There is a sort of saying, you should form yourself into economics so that you can run your business, and that's the only thing that matters, right? Don't study humanities, don't go out there. That's very bad entrepreneurial mistake. That's one of the greatest mistakes, as a matter of fact, making people believe that fundamentally it's all mechanical, right? You have to go out there, you will automatically understand how the world works. Usually it doesn't happen. Usually there are many extremizations. Usually there are many mistakes, even in perspective, right? Of what is the most important thing, of what you should be investing in, literally in your entire life, not just from an economical point of view, meant from a financial point of view. Let's put it in this way, but probably in the economical point of view, in the broader sense of word. That oikonomikos, as etymologically speaking, is about the management of the house. This is how the term economy came about with Greece, where the oikaiaka were actually the enlarged house, like probably the not neighborhood, but let's say your holdings in generally speaking, and how to manage them, and how to observe, in fact, from that perspective, the thing, not from a universalistic, like axiomatic, rationalistic view. It's not that today we believe in the homo economicus anymore. We know that humans are irrational. Humans are do things that first of all is also largely unpredictable. But still, knowing a bit more about human nature can definitely help, right? Rather than just knowing numbers. And I'm speaking from the perspective of a person that, first of all, doesn't understand much of economics, of course. I studied 1 year of economics, but it didn't end well. I mean, it was not a better experience, but I abandoned it, as you know. And that, however, believes fundamentally in classical economy, right? At least my broader and superficial, though, understanding of economics has to do with this. And I know, as far as I'm concerned, that of course the most advanced and refined economical theories are very wired to these problems. So I'm not lecturing economists or people that would like to know more about economics. I'm definitely not a reliable figure in that regard. nor who is a reliable figure, but I'm definitely less than other people who study those things. Uh, but in general, I think that those economical theories are realizing how, this is exactly the problem. We don't have a greater calculator that can sort the whole human society and politics out. Right? If we did that, I mean, we have systems actually, even artificial intelligence today, that can predict, in spite of major events, in which I could include easily coronavirus, for example, or other, I don't know, say regional conflicts or something like that, that can always break out. Can predict better than economists, right? As far as I understand, we arrived at that point in certain levels, but this is somewhat a trick. I think that what we should really invest in there, essentially, is human brain. And human brain fed with as much information about the same human society and politics overall. Right? That's the most sound economical investment you can do. Right? No time is wasted reading, studying history if you're really interested in economics, or reading the Bible, or studying chemistry, or anything that is literally about what the humanity has produced, right? And you will find a lot of that, and you'll find that very often, some of the greatest economists are also, cultured people, or people who have a deeper view of the world, not based just on economical studies, but on lots of other things that by definition should be encompassed economically. I can tell you that myself, I see life economically, literally, in terms of sheer quantities and forces, etc. The problem, you can't really quantify them easily, and therefore the only way to get those variables more accurately, at least, is to feed yourself with information, right? And this is a very, kind of very ideal picture of the world, but I think that these examples drawn from history can help you starting to dimension what, if anything, the size of the scale of the problem really is. And that's already a very good risk assessment. It is very healthy for an economical approach to reality. You can't start without. But anyway, this is just my ramble and rambling and philosophizing in a improper way, I would say. Yeah, in a non